Go live. Send a message. It's going to make a noise in just a minute.
I love the yellow submarine over your left shoulder.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, and then also the Trontric thing over your right shoulder. I have a little one of those in my room.
Do you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I try to get all my, it's like when you're in the trenches, you start praying to every god.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get all my bases covered back here. So I've got Gonzo and Tom Servo and Daleks and all that. All right. Well, here we are. Thank you everyone for joining us for yet another episode of Wit and Wisdom. My name is Corey DeVos, editor-in-chief, integrallife.com. I'm here as always with Dr. Keith Witt. Dr. Keith, how you doing, my man?
Doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. It's a beautiful day in Boulder.
Beautiful day in Santa Barbara. You and I are a couple of lucky guys.
I love the springtime. Springtime, something new comes online to me. It's probably because like the entire northern hemisphere is, procreating at the same time, and you sort of morphically kind of, you start feeling the groove a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of Leela in the air.
Yeah, for sure.
Leela is having a good time right now.
Well, today we've got, another fascinating topic for us to explore, which is something that's been in the headlines a lot in recent weeks, which is the college admissions scandals. And Keith, you sent, as you typically do, a pretty long set of notes in preparation for this. And I was fascinated to see how deeply you're able to dig into this and looking at this through the lens of, not only sort of the integral psychological lens, but also typologies and genetics and all of that. I think it's going to be a really cool show. I think people are going to really enjoy this one. And as usual, I'm hoping you can start us off, give us sort of a lay of the land. Let us know what's been going on with the scandal. And then, dig in.
Sure. So as almost everybody knows, there's been this big college scandal going on this last month where this guy in LA had an organization where he took vast amounts of money from celebrities and rich, successful people and used it to cheat their kids into prestigious colleges. You look like you had something that you wanted to say, or?
No, your audio went out for a moment. I wasn't sure if it was just my end or if it went out altogether. So can you re-say what you, just to be safe, just re-say what you just said?
Sure. So last month, we've been getting story after story about this college admissions scandal where actors and rich people and famous people paid a lot of money to this guy in LA who had an organization that created side doors into admission to prestigious colleges like SC, Harvard, Yale, and places like that, okay? And there was a variety of ways he did it. He hired people to take their kids' SATs or correct their SATs. He bribed coaches to give kids who weren't athletes athletic scholarships. He bribed admissions people. I mean, the guy was straightforward, and he told everybody exactly what he was doing. He was committing felonies, and they were committing felonies working with him. These rich, famous people whose kids could have gotten into any one of hundreds of colleges legitimately committed felonies and paid anywhere from $50,000 or $75,000 to $500,000 to more. So their kids could get into these specific prestigious colleges. And so now, this is what has been one of my most enjoyable scandals. I was enjoying this scandal for a variety of reasons. One reason that I enjoyed this scandal is because we all like it when the mighty are brought low because they screwed up. Also, it's been an unfair system forever. There are so many ways to legally cheat your kids into a preferred position. There's legacies. There's tutoring. There's getting your kid a psychological diagnosis so that they get extra time to take tests. There's SAT prep classes. And if you think about an SAT prep class, the SAT is designed to see how much you know. And so some kids are taking classes to take the test compared to kids who are not taking classes. So it has never been a fair system. And so seeing the system revealed as unfair, some parents pay as much as $10,000 or $20,000 to hire college coaches to start their kids when they're 14 or 15, getting ready to appeal to colleges. And they have connections there, and they take kids there, and they meet people and so on. So there's lots of ways that people legally cheat. So that was another reason I enjoyed it. But also, I was enjoying it a little bit too much. All right, Keith, why are you enjoying this too much? And I realized I was enjoying it too much because there's a part of me that was feeling this comfortable sense of competitive superiority. And part of that was, I didn't have to do any of that stuff to get into a good college and didn't care that much about the prestige of my college. I went to UCSB because there was surf on campus, and I read that there were more women than men on the campus, and it was 100 miles away from where I was raised. It was a beautiful spot. I mean, I didn't think it in terms of any of those other terms. A lot of people didn't back in the 60s. And also, I've been studying type a lot. I've been studying the genetics of personality. I just synchronistically have been in the middle of that, and then this scandal hit. And I thought, okay, well, maybe you're enjoying it so much because there's a part of you, Keith, that enjoyed winning in that environment. But from what the studies have shown me, this is a book called Blueprint by a guy named Robert Plomin. I read a half-page interview with him, and he made a couple of claims about his data that I found counterintuitive. One of them being that random events tended to affect kids' development more than parenting style. It didn't make any sense to me. And I thought, well, either I'm going to disagree with his research style or his data, or there's something here that's going to expand my understanding. And so, of course, I bought the book and started studying it like I do with stuff like this. Like many of us in Integral do when we find something that doesn't make sense, we want to dive deeper into it. And there, apparently, almost every personality trait has about 50% heritability. In other words, what explains the individual difference between people is about 50% heritable with almost any personality trait. And personality in general is about 40% heritable. Academic achievement is 60% heritable. Reading skills, 60% heritable. IQ, 50% heritable. Reading problems, disabilities, 60% heritable. Weight, 70% heritable. And the way that this guy Robert Plomin found out about all this stuff is he did twin studies, sibling studies, and he gathered together data from twin studies all around the world where identical twins, fraternal twins, and siblings were raised in different families. And he just studied, and many other people did, to find out what were the environmental effects and on development, and what were the genetic effects. So he found about 50% of stuff was heritable. And so I'm all happy about, I was able to compete academically. Well, I happen to inherit an awful lot of academic capacity, and I was raised by an elementary school teacher and a high school teacher. So I had huge advantages going into that environment. I don't seem to have any learning disability. I thought, Keith, so what is this? Let's go deeper into this. Going deeper into this, often when we talk about type, we forget how heavily structured we are by our instincts. So about 99% of the human genome is shared. All of us have two eyes in the front, stuff like that. The nose is here. And all of us have drives to have position on personally important social hierarchies. All of us have some degree of competitiveness. All of us have some degree of self-transcendence. All of us have the sex drives. All of us have drives to give advantages to our children, our family, and our tribe. These are all genetically determined. And to a certain extent, if you look through culture, a lot of the lower right laws and rules of culture have been designed to stop people from using wealth and power to subjugate and diminish everybody else. So the idea of having equal opportunity was a huge developmental achievement, but we tend to mistake equal opportunity for giving everybody a chance to have an equal outcome. That's just not the case. We have different genetic legacies, and apparently 50% of who we turn out to be is very much determined by our genetic legacy. The other 50%, very little of that variance of individual differences is parenting, according to his work. Now, I think he misread his own data, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Going back to the scandal, what we have here is cultures where all these people feel entitled. All of them have either wealth or fame. And like all human beings, they have doubts and they have fears. And like all human beings, they want to have position in their cultures, and they want their kids to. And so to whatever extent they want their kid to have the Harvard, almost everybody that I've ever met who went to Harvard will let me know within 10 minutes of when I first meet them that they went to Harvard. It's become kind of a personality test, or Yale, those two. Sometimes Stanford, less so with SC, because SC doesn't have the history that those two have, but it's quite fascinating. They wanted their kids to have that, and they wanted to brag to their friends at the cocktail party that their kids were in Harvard or their kid was in Yale. And so those desires and that sense of entitlement led them to go these extra steps to commit these felonies to have this advantage. And then to those of us that feel all superior and stuff, well, pretty much everybody that I know has committed felonies. I certainly have. Now, my felonies don't involve ripping other people off in that particular kind of way. But, we all think in certain situations that our moral system or our entitlement trumps the larger structure. And obviously these people did too. And they did it with their kids. Even more interesting to me is that it reflected a whole cultural bias towards parenting. We have a culture that tells us what is higher and lower status, okay? We have genetic inclinations to be certain kinds of people. So we're in good shape if the kind of person we want to be fits with a high status position or job according to our family and our culture. If there isn't that fit, we tend to get critical judgments from parents. We tend to get critical judgments from cultures. Some of the highest happiness indices in professions are in the trades, carpenter, plumber, that kind of stuff. And if you think about it, now white collar jobs, because we're in a culture that privileges white collar jobs in every way, gives people more status, gives people more money, gives people more benefits generally. But if you're going to be in the trades, you're more likely to go to something that you like. Okay. You start out doing everything and you go, well, I really like plumbing. So you end up being a plumber. Or I really like framing. You end up being a framer. I've seen this with lawyers. I worked with one lawyer that was a DA that found being a DA so horrible, he tried to kill himself. I found other lawyers that loved being DAs. It was just obviously a combination of their type asserting itself. And according to Plumman's research, the older that we get, the more our genetic type tends to influence our choices. So type tends to influence, say, us about 40% at childhood, 60% in adolescent, and more like 80% as adults. Now, the way that Plumman reads that research is he thinks people are more being governed by their genetic demands. I think what it is people are choosing to integrate what they're interested in and what they find in the culture and the values with who they are. And as people make those choices, then they become more purely who they are. Now part of the deal around this is we have embedded in us these standards and we impose them on our children. And not only that, when you look at development, a lot of what we've seen as parenting has been, according to his research, is the type of child somehow evokes some quality in the parent and then creates an inner subjectivity that tends to guide that child in a particular way. And that's heavily genetically determined. Even more, now we get psychological. There's always traits in us and aspects of our personality that we find objectionable or shameful. Why? No individual meets all the standards of their family and culture. And so we all grow up with a certain amount of endogenous shame that we deal with in a lot of ways. We suppress it, project it, all that other kind of stuff. Well, if there's parts of me that I don't like, if my kid has some of those aspects, as they're likely to have, since 50% of personality traits are heritable, I'm not going to like those things in my kid. Communicating disapproval to my kid, which then in turn is experienced by that kid as shameful, which then turns into my kids' internalized conflicts, and so on. And you can see this is one of the explanations of the intergenerational transmission of both positive stuff and negative stuff. Fast forward to the scandal that we're talking about. None of these families, as far as I can tell, looked at their kid and said, what type of person is this kid? And how can I help my kid be the healthiest, most successful, happiest version of who they are? They had external standards that were brought by them and by the culture that they were projecting onto their kids. And I can just see these kids being pressured to be successful according to their parents' standards throughout their life, refusing to do it. Why? It's very, very hard to go against type. And then their parents going, well, I guess you just haven't been that super student or that super athlete that I've wanted you to be. So let me see. I think what we'll do is we'll hire somebody to successfully lie about you being a super student or super athlete so that you can go to a prestigious school. And so later on, you can lie about the fact that you got into a prestigious school, and that then reflects well on you with this prestigious school. Another interesting finding that Plomin had is this: once you corrected for heritability, there wasn't that much difference between academic outcomes in schools. About 2% of variance in when he was looking at schools in England. What did happen, though, is that some schools selected for people that had more capacities. And of course, they had higher test scores. Why did they have higher test scores? Because they had better teachers? Well, if you just factor in do multivariable analysis of all the data, most of it was explained by heritability. Now, that being said, this is where I think that Plomin is misreading his own data, because of the human superpower of choice. Mm. And also, where he's misreading his data, he's not a psychotherapist. It's not like he's hostile to psychotherapy, but being a psychotherapist, you're much more familiar with the interiors of people at every stage of development. And what we know from the Enneagram, and one of the reasons we like the Enneagram, is that the Enneagram isn't just 9 types. If you take into account wings and so on, and you know the 3 different subtypes, you know there's numerous different types, and the Enneagram is understood as there's less healthy and more healthy versions of each type, and that everybody has their own unique combination. This has intuitively appealed to evolutionaries and integral people forever. Why is that? Because apparently that really reflects how we're put together. Okay. That we have these general drives, you know, all the major ones that we share that are enacted in us according to our type, which all the personality variables are about 50% heritable. And then we make choices in response to our environment. And this is where the 50% of non-systematic environmental effects, I think, affect development. Parents can create environments where children are more likely to have positive experiences and more likely to process those experiences in ways that help them develop. For instance, growth mindsets. A growth mindset is that effort and progress is more important than absolute achievement. That can be taught, and that wasn't studied in his work. Emotionally dismissing versus emotionally coaching parental styles. Emotionally coaching parent styles tend to produce kids that have more affect regulation and more success. Again, that can be taught, just as optimistic and pessimistic explanatory styles can, and cultivated. Also, there are parents these days that are more sensitive to the fact that different kids evoke different traits in parents and can work on those traits to become better parents. I had to work way harder to be a less effective parent to my daughter than I did with my son, because my daughter has some of the characteristics in her that I find difficult in me. And so that challenged me to grow as a father with her, and I grew as fast as I could with that. And so we're in a position in the modern age to be able to understand that. What that does is it gives our children more of a chance to understand these processes. And then as they become more formal operational as teenagers and adults, to go back and find those endogenous defensive states and the shame that they have about some parts of themselves that don't fit with the culture or that maybe they felt disapproved of. And then integrate those into a larger sense of self where you can have a sense of radical acceptance of who I am. But radical acceptance of who I am has to take into account whatever type I am. And I might not be a type that wants to go to Harvard, and I might be the type that, I don't know, wants to build houses or bridges or frame houses or, play video games. It's the culture privileges people that get jobs that are self-sustaining and have passions that have high status by the cultural standards and provide people with money. Okay? Mm-hmm. What if what really turns me on is something that doesn't do that? What if what really turns me on is learning how to play the harmonica? Okay, well, artists, you can be a really great artist and not make much money or have much status. Okay? That's a culturally determined value that privileges some types over others. And so now we're beginning to see the complex algorithm of development, culture, and so on, self-cult, body, mind, spirit, and self-culture and nature. And it's revealed in these scandals and in our reactions to the scandals. I mean, I doubt if many people in reaction to this scandal said, boy, I'm sure, would I do that if I had that opportunity? Now, I don't think I would have done that if I had the opportunity. I don't know if that's because I'm a fear type, I'm an A type 6, or if because there's certain kinds of transgressions, certain kinds of cheating that just feel inherently immoral to me. Like I don't feel immoral driving 75 in a 65. I didn't feel immoral in the 60s, the 70s, not declaring cash on my income. But 1981, my wife, Becky, took over our books, and she said, I'm not going to take over the books unless we declare everything. I said, what do you mean? Nobody declares cash. And she said, I don't care. If you want me to do it. And so I just started declaring cash, I think in 81 or 82, or whenever she took over. And I felt so much better. But before that, it had been moral for me to not do that, which is against the law, I guess. And so it didn't bring us into a sense of self-reflection about moral relativism in our culture. And now all of us, to some extent, want advantages for ourselves and our kids. It didn't bring into conversation the idea that we live in a meritocracy, but a meritocracy which is based on equal opportunity really isn't that fair. That's not a just society because some people need a lot more help to do things. Some people need a lot less help. Some people are naturally successful in some areas, some people aren't. And so if we're in a just society, to the people that have difficulty being who they are in a healthy way, they should get more support from the collective to be a happy, healthy, successful person in whatever type they are. And that's the kind of stuff that has been arisen for me out of all of this. And coming back to psychotherapy, education, and parenting, as parents, in a way, our responsibility is to teach kids basic literacy skills and mathematical skills, and then go, okay, who are you? And what's the healthy version of who you are? And what kind of learning lights you up? Let's have you have more of that learning. In other words, let's find out your unique type and help you grow into that. So education becomes, with kids, less about everybody has to be knowing the same stuff and more about people kind of having basic common knowledge and then growing in their own personal fashion. And parenting becomes less about the kid becoming who I'd like them to be or what's prestigious in the culture, and more about me discovering who my child is and what is easy and hard for me to support in that. And if it's hard for me to support it, my job is to grow as a parent to support it more. And in psychotherapy, yes, we want to have radical acceptance, but radical acceptance of ourselves and being able to move forward means a radical acceptance of our strengths and weaknesses depending upon who we are. And about half of who we are is heritable. And the other half is random events that we can learn to be more alert to or less alert to. There's a wonderful series of studies that was done by a psychologist named Richard Wiseman, who wrote a book called The Luck Factor. And he found that certain people were luckier than other people, that was a trait, probably heritable. He didn't do genetic research on it, but he found, interestingly, that he could teach people how to be luckier. And so he did. And he had some objective standards where people who did his training got to be luckier people. That started with being whoever they were and then cultivating the characteristics of lucky people until they developed new habits of being lucky, which brings us to choice again. No matter how we're predisposed, we can learn new habits. If I'm predisposed to be aggressive, I can learn habits of compassionate attunement. And it'll be much harder for me to develop habits of compassionate attunement to someone who's naturally more cooperative. But I can learn that habit, and that habit will become hardwired into my unconscious because I've chosen that. And what that'll mean is I'll still be more aggressive, but I'll be more aggressive in a more healthy way, which fits with Plomin's data about genetics having more effects as we grow, but also fits with the understanding that we've all had that kids with that are securely attached do better, and the studies support that. And all humans seem to be predisposed to have secure attachment. And kids that are protected do better. There's an enormous amount of data about the amount of abuse or neglect being associated with negative effects, outcomes. So given all that stuff, still, even though those things matter, the way that they matter is now we're creating situations where our kids can grow into becoming more themselves. Our clients can grow into becoming more themselves, and we support that process. People have been telling me throughout my career for 40 years, they'll come in and they'll go, I don't think people change. And I'll go, I agree. I don't think people change much. I'm not much in the business. I'm in the business of helping you become more thoroughly who you are. Becoming more happily and healthily and successfully who you are. And this genetic research seems to support that. And if these people that were part of this college scandal had been introspective in any way, they would have been talking to someone and someone said, look, if you're going to give your kid advantages, there's plenty of legal ways to give your kid advantages. And there's plenty of great colleges that your kid can get into. You don't have to go out and commit felonies to have your kid go to Harvard or SC or Stanford. Apparently, one thing about privilege is you can gate what kind of feedback you get. And apparently these people were gating the kind of feedback they were getting and weren't getting that feedback. And of course, they're suffering the consequences. So there you go. And, I'm going back to Integral, Ken knew that type mattered. It's not just states. I mean, the way that type is enacted is through states. What type we are generates states of consciousness, and those states have stories and impulses and so on. And we can change certain aspects of our type by learning new habits of thinking and being and so on. But it really matters. It's a central characteristic. And all we have to do is look at primate research to understand how heavily influenced we are by genetic imperatives. And so it's important to realize that, take that into account, and then say, all right, we can all grow, we can become who we want to be, but we need to be able to find out who we are, accept that, and integrate that into an ever expanding, as we go through the value memes, take all the people that we are with us, okay? Not repress, dissociate, and leave parts of us essentially in states of arrested development where we haven't grown that part of us, and it comes up and it bites us. The way that teachers end up having sexual transgressions because they haven't allowed themselves to grow in their psychosexual line of development and so on. And so there's just an awful lot that's revealed by this scandal and by everybody's reaction to it.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful summary, Keith. And like you, I also always get really, sort of fascinated. Sometimes it feels like a morbid fascination, feels a little bit macabre, but I always kind of lean in when these scandals happen because they are so interesting and they are so, revealing. It's sort of, we're able to see how the system either, finds more resiliency or breaks down when it rubs up against these different types of behaviors and these different types of cultural values. And whenever it does that, whenever it breaks down, it gives us this just beautiful cross section, of sort of our collective American psychograph.
Yes, yes, the American psychograph.
Yeah. Which is fascinating. So, here in your breakdown, Keith, which again was really beautiful. So, you started off talking about this, we all have this evolutionary impulse to make our kids' lives better than our own.
Yeah.
And that's good. That's a good thing. That's how we've made it so long in the story, after 50,000 years of human development and all that. That's kind of why we're still around and why novelty continues to emerge. So that's a very positive thing. However, where these breakdowns occur is that this evolutionary impulse, this natural evolutionary impulse, then gets filtered through our personal, preferences and typologies in the upper left. One of those preferences being, for example, we tend to prefer comfort over adversity. And that comes into play when we're trying to create a better lives for our kids. Oftentimes we do so by insulating them from adversity and making them more comfortable. We want them to be more comfortable than we were when we were young, not realizing that so much of the happiness that we as adults feel today is due to the adversity that we faced as children and as adolescents.
And so also we want them to be better than other people.
Right.
Like 80% of college professors say they do above average work. Okay, well, wait a minute.
Right.
80%. So it's not okay to be average in things.
Right.
And we don't want our kids to be average and so if our kid is, we want them to be above average.
Right. And we certainly don't want them to be uncomfortable. One of the things we were talking about before the show is this kind of cultural transition that a lot of parents are making. And I think this is probably primarily true for liberal parents, but I'm sure this is, sort of across the board where, parents, they used to be described as helicopter parents. So the parents would always hover wherever their kids were going. And now they're actually calling them snowplow parents, where it's like, okay, I'm going to take a look at what's coming up in my kid's path, and I'm going to remove every possible obstacle out of that path so that they can be as comfortable and as successful and, again, not have to deal with any of the painful adversities that really I think are so galvanizing for a person. That's when sort of, we've spent how many hours talking about how conflict enhances human beings. It actually, it brings these sort of, deeper structures and these deeper wisdoms to the surface.
College professors are complaining about parents calling them up and pressuring them about giving their kid an A instead of a B in their class. One kid got caught cheating. And so the parent came and got all over the professor for failing him.
Right.
How dare you fail my son for cheating?
Yeah.
He didn't even deny the kid was cheating. He just says, so what's your point? He was cheating. Give him the test again. Professor said, no.
Right.
And so there you go, the snowplow parent.
Well, it's funny, Keith, because there used to be an alliance between the teacher and the parent against the kid.
That's right.
And I think those alliances have changed in recent decades, where now it's the kid and the parent versus the teacher and versus the institution.
In a lot of cases, and that's an extent that is reflecting the extended adolescence one.
Right.
It's happening in the 20s. And there's a great book called The Defining Decade by Meg Jay about 20-somethings. And also, I think it's reflected in the fact that the generation now 14 to 24 is one of the least happy generations that's been measured over the last several generations.
Yeah.
I don't think that this is good for kids and families
Yep.
to have parents be so competitive, because what they're doing is trying to force kids to meet what the parents see as cultural ideals, and who the kid is gets the type of kid gets lost in that. And so what if I really want to be an electrician? Okay,
Right.
but my parents really want me to be a lawyer.
Yep.
Well, there's going to be a problem, and I'm unlikely to find out that I want to be an electrician.
Yep.
Yep. Or they want me to be a lawyer, and I want to be a chemical engineer. I mean, I go on and on about stuff like this.
Yep.
That sense of when my child is born, I begin a process of discovering who this child is and helping them be the healthiest, happiest, most successful version of that I can within the context of an open system family. All the things that we know that create healthy families and
Right.
relationships between parents and kids. And also recognizing that every kid is going to have a different experience. And
Right.
the data shows that siblings growing up in the same family are as different as if you separated them at birth and put them in other families.
Mm.
If you measured their typology 10, 15, 20, 30 years later, they're way more like their biological siblings and their biological parents than they are like their adopted siblings and parents in many, many ways.
Right. Right.
More so than we thought before in psychotherapy.
Right. Well, so all that is speaking to how, again, this evolutionary impulse to make your child's life better than your own gets filtered through the upper left quadrant. In the lower left quadrant, it's getting filtered through our various cultural mores and values, things like status and reputation, and all of these cultural expectations and pressures that are both put on us as children as well as on us as parents.
And as adults, from the inside and from the outside.
Right. Yeah.
The inner pressures to self-transcend and to have position on important hierarchies. There's the external pressures from culture.
Yep.
And then there's the internalized pressures from parents' approvals and disapprovals that have been internalized in terms of our value system about ourselves and our attitudes towards ourselves in terms of relative self-esteem and self-love.
Yep.
All these things fit into the algorithm.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And then we shift over to the lower right quadrant where you've got things like, socioeconomic factors, social mobility and opportunity, wealth inequality, as well as technologies. I mean, social media has been study after study after study talking about how social media impacts our mental health and happiness, because we're constantly comparing sort of the minutia of our own lives to the best of everyone else's lives that are around us. We're constantly we're constantly seeing this stream of nothing but the most positive, happy experiences that our friends and peers are having. And this actually has a corrosive effect upon our own mental health and our own happiness.
Yeah, with attribution theory, not to mention not just socioeconomic stuff, but gender stuff and ethnicity stuff.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, before we go any further, Corey and I are we got in a conversation about why people came to Integral. And so we came out with a questionnaire. It's only got 6 questions that we're sending to everybody. And we really appreciate it if you filled it out and send it back, because we wanted to know what brought people to Integral. So we came up with 4 or 5 different ways. And so we're sending it out. We'll announce it again at the end of this. But when you get it, please fill it out and send it back so that we can have some data about what got people interested in Integral in the first place. So
that's right. If you're watching on integrallife.com/live right now, you can actually see the survey right underneath this video right now. So go ahead, fill it out. The survey will also be available when we publish this piece to integrallife.com. So it'll be there as well. So yeah, please fill it out, because we want to learn more about you. We want to learn what kind of content is going to be the most helpful for you, the most valuable for you, is going to help you grow up, wake up, clean up, show up, all that good stuff. But to finish this gestalt, Keith, so those are, we just identified 3 of the main dimensions that this evolutionary impulse to make our kids' lives better than our own are getting pushed through. And then you've got obviously the upper right, which are these sort of genetic predispositions.
Right.
which are, completely out of our control. It's just sort of the substrate of our experience.
Well, partly, but also epigenetics exist.
Hmm.
What genes are activated is heavily determined by environment, and we have lots of primate studies where we've been able to sacrifice the animals and look at their brains. We also have human studies. Meditation changes people's brains. Parenting changes what genes are expressed. You can take the same genome and give a negative parenting experience and a positive parenting experience, and different genes will be expressed in those two genomes. And this is another thing I'm assuming the Robert Plomin, you can't include everything in your work.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually do have a lot of influence over how genes are expressed by decisions that we make, which brings us to, the magic of the human capacity to decide.
Right.
I've said for years that focused intent and action in service of principle and driven by resolve is a human superpower, because I've seen people who have an intent and act on it, and they have principles supporting it, and they're resolved to continue with it. They can do almost anything. Now, some people that's easier, people that were born with a lot of conscientiousness, which is a personality trait. Some people it's harder. Some people it's easier because they're born with more cooperativeness and they can get more help to do it.
Right.
People that weren't, it's more difficult. But still, it's a superpower that we all have access to with our own strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
There's the wild card. There's where a lot of those non-systematic events come that account for half of the variance between individuals.
Right.
And I think that the parents organize that and organize kids' understandings of that and how kids respond to that. But I think that they do it so that those variables that I just described, the parents who do that or who don't do that, are non-predictable, that the kid, it doesn't come out as a parenting effect. It comes out as a non-systematic effect.
Right.
But I think parents have huge effects on that.
Yeah, well said. Well, all of this, I think this is fascinating to me, obviously, because I am a parent. I've got a 6-year-old girl. And just like everyone else in the world, I want her to have a better life than I have. Mm-hmm. And so, that requires me to make a series of decisions about, how to protect her, when to protect her, when not to protect her, so even though all of us want our kids to be healthier and happier than we are, when we don't understand the variables that produce mental health, good mental health and happiness in the first place, well, it's easy to see how these different pressures in all 4 quadrants sort of, have a corrupting effect upon that, again, that very good impulse to make my kids' lives as wonderful as they can possibly be. And I think that this is, a major reason, Keith, why, we were talking again before the show about the fact that, wealthy families, 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the 2nd generation. I think it's something like 90 to 95% of these families lose it by the time they're in the 3rd generation. Right. And there's been a lot of, sort of sociological data, surrounding all of this. And what it appears to look like is that, the generation that originally creates the wealth, well, one of the reasons that they created the wealth in the first place is they've got, the ambition, they've got the fortitude, they've got the right sort of sets of adversity that they have had to deal with and overcome in order to create something new in this universe. And the
random events.
Yeah, tons of
random events.
Yeah, absolutely. And but the next generation, because they grew up insulated by that wealth, insulated from adversity, insulated from, a lot of things that people without wealth have to experience, and therefore cultivate new perspectives by sort of, having a first person experience of the real friction of life. And, there tends to be a lot more friction at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder than there is at the top end. So a lot of these kids in these successive generations, they're growing up with less ambition. They're growing up, being less comfortable with adversity. They're oftentimes less altruistic than their parents.
One statistic that I found very revealing is that the amount of problems in psychopathology for super wealthy kids of super wealthy families, super privileged families, is about the same as for super poor families. But it's different pathologies. The super poor kids will get in trouble for carrying weapons, self-protection stuff, doing things to get a few extra bucks. The super privileged kids will get in trouble for stealing from each other, doing pranks, being oppositional. But both of them have statistically more problems. Okay?
Right.
More challenges. Arguably, the conditions of the type of person plus whatever social conditions they grew up in accounted for the success of parents who then created social conditions that were different social conditions for their kids who might be similar types to them. The interplay, but when I read this research, I go, okay, now how does this translate into horizontal and vertical health? Mm-hmm. Are there certain types that are more likely to engage in to have vertical development? Absolutely. Self-transcendent is a psychological variable that has probably about 50% heritability. Some people are going to be born with an awful lot of self-transcendence. Some people will be born with less. Mm-hmm. People born with a lot of self-transcendence are going to be the seekers who are actively pushing to find that next perspective, that next level. And that can be true. Here's another interesting statistic. Divorce is about 35% heritable. So you can take a kid and put them and adopt them into a family. And then if that kid's biological parent subsequently divorces, that kid's more likely is more likely to be like their biological parent in terms of divorce than their adoptive parents. Divorce, TV watching is about 30% heritable. How much TV you watch be 30% heritable? If you do twin studies and sibling studies, you find out that there's just a certain personality characteristic that makes you more vulnerable to watch more TV.
Right. Is it people who are more distractible or something like that? Or what's sort of the governing principle there?
Well, I don't know about TV. With divorce, it was associated with people that were impulsive and joyful. People that were impulsive and joyful were more likely to divorce. Go figure. I mean, I could kind of put that together with some stuff, but it was just one of those correlations that I went, that's interesting.
Right. Well, Keith, I think this proves. I think what you're talking about proves really two things that are both simultaneously true. A, more money, more problems.
Yeah, that's true.
That definitely. I mean, there is wisdom to that. And B, money can buy you happiness. And the reason why I'm saying this is because we're seeing such pathology at either end of sort of the wealth spectrum. And there's studies saying that money does in fact buy happiness, but there is rapidly diminishing returns once you get past about $70,000 a year or so.
That's exactly right. And money can also buy you opportunities. Money can buy you enrichment and so on.
Yep. Well, that's again one of the paradoxes that we're sort of in, Keith, is that a lot of the privileged kids, the kids who grow up in wealthy families, they're handed far more social mobility, far more opportunities for social mobility than 95% of the other kids. However, due to their wealth and in the insulative sort of effects that it has, they oftentimes have fewer socially desirable qualities that would otherwise be sort of organically selected for by society.
Well, sometimes not. I think that it in a way it's a little more complicated in terms of if you're a friendly person, you're going to be a friendly person. Likability is inherent. I've worked with kids that come from privileged families and so on, and I've worked with poor kids, earlier in my career than now. It's not easy being a human being.
Well, that's for sure.
I mean, every human being involves having to compromise and integrate incredible forces that are lifelong forces. And nobody is exempt from that.
Right.
So there's there's different value memes have different challenges, different socioeconomic levels have different challenges, but there's just none where it's easy. It's an easy process. At some point, we have to take responsibility for our own development, one way or another, and we make choices.
Right.
And people that get in the habit of making healthier choices become healthier versions of their type. And as they do that, then good things happen for them.
Sure. And yeah, totally.
People that make poor decisions, poor choices, less healthy decisions, they become less healthy versions. And ultimately bad things happen. Right. And then we have cultures that pressure us to make good or bad decisions. For instance, America pressures everybody to make bad diet decisions. America pressures people to make bad work decisions in terms of how much work you do. Americans work more hours than any other country. America has pressures to have people make more poor healthcare decisions, based on economics because of and poor pharmaceutical decisions based on the advertising and the culture of using pharmaceuticals. And so, we're all having to deal with those interfaces.
For sure.
And to be a happy person, at some level, you need to eventually go. On some levels, I'm going to be an outlier. And that's not a bad thing. I think ultimately that, when self-acceptance involves understanding we're all unique and I'm unique, and my job is to keep being a healthier version of me. And my job with my kids and with my clients and with everybody else is to help them do the same.
Right. No, that's an important point. And we certainly don't want to overgeneralize. I think maybe the point I'm trying to make is that every sort of socioeconomic class is going to come with its own, sort of different set of blinders. So if you're born into poverty, that's going to give you a particular type of filter that you're enacting your world through. And there's going to be limitations to that filter in terms of what you can see and what you miss.
Yeah, blind spots.
Exactly. Same thing if you're born into a mega wealthy family and it's sort of like the Buddha story where you don't even need to know that things like sickness and death exist in the world until it hits you at some point later in your development, and sort of the house of cards comes tumbling down. Both of these mentalities are, can be damaging for people. And it just seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that a lot of kids who are born into middle-class families, yes, they also have their own set of sort of blinders and filters that they enact their world through, but it's probably going to be a little bit more permeable only because their experience isn't quite so extremely different, you know what I mean, than what the sort of the median, American experience looks like.
Well, at least statistics support that in terms of psychopathology statistics. David Brooks made a great point about Joe Biden yesterday. I was watching, I like David Brooks. People have been claiming about Joe Biden grabbing women's shoulders and, kissing their heads and whispering in their ears and stuff. And David Brooks said, uncharacteristically of commentators, he said, I grew up in a different social class than, he grew up in upper middle class, maybe upper class, I don't know, Jewish East Coast culture. And Joe Biden grew up in working class Scranton, Pennsylvania culture. And he said in that culture, there's a lot more backslapping, grabbing people, saying hi, pressing the flesh. David Brooks said, when I went to Congress, I was surprised how many people touched me, how congressmen would come up and grab my shoulders and get into my personal space. And essentially he was making the point from a standpoint of the lack of understanding that the person that I'm dealing with might not feel honored by the fact that I'm a U.S. senator and I'm, grabbing your shoulders and telling you you're going to be great. I might feel intruded upon by that. That was invisible to Joe Biden until somebody made it visible. And so David Brooks said that's a lack of understanding of essentially value meme, which he didn't use that term, but he was talking from an integral standpoint. And not about Joe Biden being an icky guy. He's not an icky guy. But, he didn't realize until recently that doing something like that with some people would go, God, Joe Biden grabbed me by the shoulders. That was so cool. And another person goes, God, that was in my personal space.
Right.
It's being aware of all different types and being a little bit cautious about that.
Yeah, no, totally. No, it's an important point. Well, and what I want to do, and I do want to open this up for questions. So if anyone who's watching right now, if you have a question and you're in the Zoom app with us, you can either raise your hand or you can hit the Q&A button and type your question and we'll read it on the air. But before we do, Keith, it seems to me just as I'm thinking about these two different sets of blinders that exist both for privileged and underprivileged people, we've got a name for the type of blinders that happens with wealthy kids. And, this was sort of a big deal in culture a couple of years ago. It's a term called affluenza.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right, which was actually used in a court case to try to justify, I can't remember what the exact story was. Some kid did a hit and run, or I can't remember what the exact circumstances were, but they tried to get him off. And I think they actually did get him off by saying, look, he's got affluenza. He's been so privileged his entire life. He hasn't had the opportunity to learn what values are and da 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 da. And, I'm not saying that this is sort of generically, inevitably what's going to happen to your kids if you're rich. Clearly it's not. However, it's statistically significant enough for us to talk about, because the common pattern that I'm seeing both within sort of the affluenza community and the poverty mentality is opportunism. Mm-hmm. Right? Opportunism comes very easily to both poverty mentality and to the ultra wealthy sort of entitled class. And this brings me, I think, Keith, to something that you wrote about in your notes that I want you to just quickly address, which is, this meritocracy aristocracy. American culture and American society, we market ourselves as a meritocracy, where if you have, again, socially desirable qualities, we've got a system that will select for you and you will be able to succeed, and, all of your achievement drives will be fulfilled and all of that. And if you don't, well, you've got some more work to do, find your idea, find that socially desirable quality to make you selected for. However, in practice, we're not really very, we're not such a great meritocracy after all, because there are, there's not as much social mobility as you would expect to see in a true meritocracy.
Well, yeah. So first of all, I want to make a comment about something you said earlier, and then I want to talk about that.
Set me straight, Keith.
Well, one thing that I've noticed when people have talked about values that they grew up with, that people that I find admirable, either people that came from poverty or people who came from wealth, when they talk about the developmental values, they're pretty much saying the same thing. I had a mom or dad that believed in personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. I believed that I was with someone where you treated other people with respect and kindness. And so there's certain kinds of core values that when you dedicate yourself to them and you live them in your family and you reward them in your kids, that tends to support a more underlying drive that human beings have to share, care, and be fair with each other. And I think that's an underlying human thing that in a way transcends socioeconomic level, because I just keep seeing it again and again with people that I personally admire, however I admire them. The guy who's my gardener, okay, I really admire this guy. He has a real pure spirit and a really smart, good guy. I can't speak very well with him. He has limited English. I have limited Spanish, but clearly those values had permeated his life as they did mine, and we're joined that way. That's an interesting way that he and I are joined. So let's talk about the meritocracy aristocracy. One thing that happened in the 70s is as there have been more and more people, it's become more and more competitive. Like, for instance, it's more competitive to get into schools than it was when I was a kid. Okay, so as things get more and more competitive and as we get more oversight over competition, what happens is some kids and some families give their kids extra tools to compete, and some families either choose not to do that or they don't have the resources to do that. And so what happens is well-educated or successful families have the resources to provide tutors and provide therapists and provide doctors and provide interventions and provide um, uh, preparation courses and enrichment programs and so on, and provide the special connections that I was talking about earlier when I said there's plenty of legal ways to get an edge. So more and more and more people have that capacity, and their kids then compete better. Okay. And there's probably genetic things going on around that too, in terms of, you know, kids that are parents who are naturally good students are more likely to have children that are naturally good. 60% of academic achievement is heritable, apparently. And so what that creating is there's an aristocracy, but it's an aristocracy of some people get the extra edges in competing and some people don't. Mm-hmm. Now, in a way that's fair, though it's becoming less fair. Education is less egalitarian in the United States than it used to be. And so we're seeing actually less genetic effects when you do school studies, because if you have really a level playing field, the genetic effects tend to emerge more. If the field isn't level, they tend to not see them. And so now there's a lot of people that don't have as much access to what's associated with upward mobility in this country. And you know, relatively few people do. I was looking at some statistics. I think Atlanta, 6 or 7% of the kids in Atlanta will go up at least one socioeconomic level. I think it was 13% in San Francisco, which was the highest. Very, very little, even though this is the land of opportunity and everything. Mm-hmm. You know, at a time that happened a lot was in the 50s, because the whole culture was organized to help people enter the middle class and be happy and successful. Whole culture was organized to have people as much education as they wanted. And so, bam, there was huge upward mobility into the middle class. And also it produced lots and lots and lots and lots of super successful people. But the natural course of human culture, there was a great book on this, I can't remember, by a Frenchman recently. They said inevitably what happens is the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And as the rich get richer, they fix the system in these ways so that it's harder for people to get up and easier for them to stay on top. And one of the ways is in the meritocracy, aristocracy. Mm-hmm. Now, if we have a just society, where it's not just we're all competing, but we're all helping each other, then we start looking at other variables and start providing other forms of support for our citizens. And ultimately what this does is now we're playing into the integral value memes, because that means we're objectifying fewer and fewer people and seeing everybody as important. Okay, we're getting all the way up to green here. Okay, now when we make it to teal, at teal, we go just providing people with the support that they want, but then subtly being critical of people making decisions that we don't like. That's not going to work. We provide the people with the support they might, and they might be the healthiest version of a Trump supporter, you know, or we might provide people with all the support that they want, and they might decide on a profession that doesn't have a whole lot of social status. You know, it's interesting to me, there's certain professions like, say, musician, where if you have a pyramid, the people at the very top are doing okay and everybody else is struggling. Mm-hmm. And then you have accountants. Pretty much everybody after the second rung are doing pretty okay. Okay. Well, that's not just, you know, that's a meritocracy. And so I would like to have a meritocracy and a just society. Mm. Okay, I don't want an either or. I want to add to that. I want people to get support from the collective, being the healthiest, happiest, most successful person that they can be. And I want their parents to have help and different kinds of help depending on who people are and different kinds of support. And then that creates a social class where we can be respectful of each other around being whoever we are. Right. Now that's hard because all of us want to have high social status on some level, okay? And so that causes us we can't lose our desire to have position on personal important power hierarchies, but we can integrate that value until that position means I am myself on having the position that I want on the hierarchies that matter to me, according to my type and my interests and my passions. And I have a lot of admiration for other people doing the same. And that means some people are going to be more skilled. Some people are going to be less skilled, more wealthy, less wealthy. more interested in growth, less interested in growth.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want everybody to be the healthy, happy, successful version of themselves, and to have everybody be protected from other people messing with them.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, Keith, I feel like there's probably a whole show we could devote to this topic, which would be, you know, sort of finding value and meaning and resiliency within the sort of neoliberal waters that we're swimming in.
That's right.
Because what neoliberalism does is it creates this other sort of social pressure upon us to, you know, I often frame it as to reduce, to minimize our interior qualities into exterior quantities. And this is something that we've seen even within the human potential movement. You know, the human potential movement of the 1970s was very idealistic and was all, you know, it was Esalen Institute, and it was, you know, it was very much like we're gonna map out, you know, the human psyche with such amazing granularity. And Ken himself very much comes from that school. And then in the 1980s, that human potential movement actually sort of evolved or devolved, I think the jury's kind of out about that, into the self-help sort of industry, where suddenly it was like, okay, there's all these human potentials exist. You're not there yet. You're probably feeling some anxiety about the fact that you're not there yet, even though you know it's possible. So here's an entire cottage industry of self-help books that are gonna both help reduce that anxiety and also help you feel like you're tapping into your human potential. And then in the 90s and the aughts, that changed again. It went from self-help to things like self-efficiency and inbox zero and all this, which again was using a lot of the language of the human potential movement of the 1970s. But this was, you know, really sort of, super condensed into this right quadrant behavioral kind of dynamics, where here's how you succeed. You need to be your own brand. You know what I mean? It's an interesting conversation for me, because Integral is sort of trying to cover all these bases at once. We're very interested in human potential, obviously. We do a lot of work to help people, you know, with self-help, to help support people in their growth and awakening and all of that. And we have this other component, which is, you know, all about how to be more efficient, more resilient, more. None of that is a problem, but I think it's helpful for us to take a look at just sort of the flavor of the water that we're all swimming in, that we don't notice every day. These conversations are taking place within that space, and it can be hard to, you know, sort of make that subject into object in a certain kind of way.
Well, for me, it brings us back to our biology. You know, in a way, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, it was written about trauma, but in a way, the body keeps the score around everything. You know, my body will let me know if my life is good for it or not, and has let me know. And so there's a certain amount of work that I can do, and if I do more, I have physical consequences, and so on. And you know, now Robert Plomin, the Blueprint gene guy, thinks that all self-help books are worthless. I completely disagree. I think that what we're seeing is a culture that's arising increasingly that says people can be whoever they want to be and have permission, and then we have more room for individual variation than we ever had before, even though there are lots of cultural standards and stuff pushing down. And what we're doing at Integral is we're ahead of the trail, and trying to find ways of finding the right paths, the ones that work better and don't work worse, and help people move that evolutionary line forward in a lot of different ways. And you know, everything that you mentioned is exactly right. Since it's included in Transcend, it's all happening at the same time. Now I want to open it up. Does anybody want to ask a question or something?
Yeah, we've got, so Alex has a hand raised. I'm going to bring you on over, Alex. So get ready, get your clothes on. Here we go.
Or not.
Or not. I mean, I don't know. It can be that kind of show. And there's Alex. Alex, how are you? Oh, I can't hear you. One sec.
One sec.
Oh, try again.
Yep, I can hear you guys.
There we go.
Alex, hi.
Awesome. Hey guys, how are you?
Well,
Cool. Just want to say, a big thank you to everything that you guys are doing. This is amazing. It's really helping in terms of like navigating how to be a human. So I guess the question I have is, how do you discern between the difference between being like an authentic expression of you, your type, your essential nature, and potentially a strategy for your shadow self? So it's kind of like the difference between a healthy version of you versus a healthy version of your shadow strategy, because it's really hard to figure out what's you and what's just conditioned you.
yes. So, Werner Erhard, back in the day during the S strategy, he said people had their winning strategy, and so we developed something that gets us going, that gets us what we want, which is useful, but also it becomes a series of habits that get us locked. And the way that you discern, and I wrote a lot about this in my book Shadow Light. We're always having impulses coming in from our unconscious and thoughts and stories and stuff. And some of it is constructive, some of it is destructive. Generally, the constructive stuff has a kind of an element of compassionate understanding, but not always. So what you do is you pay attention to what's exciting to you and what's interesting to you and so on. And also what lights you up. And if you're lit up by other people being excited or being approving and so on, that's fine. But also be aware of your subjective experience. So self-attunement, mindful awareness of how am I experiencing myself and how am I experiencing other people experiencing me, over time starts delivering to you through your sensations, through your experience, what's more you and what's you complying with cultural demands. You can be super successful doing something and feel a sense of emptiness. So you go into that emptiness. What am I wanting? And then you'll get a little hint. And you move in that direction, you feel a little fuller. Okay, we put a little more of that in. And so over time, that interplay between paying attention to what feels right in your heart, what feels right intersubjectively with other people. There's certain connections with people that feel good, certain connections that don't. So say you organize yourself, I want to have more of the ones that feel good, that feel like they have a certain authenticity. I want to have less of the ones. Over time, that guides you, not just in terms of the choices that you make, but in terms of enacting the type of person that you are. You becoming more purely who you are over time. And if you're not, you'll feel bad. And if you feel bad, that's fine. Pay attention to that bad feeling. Don't try to medicate it away. 11% of everybody in the United States anyway is on some kind of psychotropic drug. That just drives me fucking crazy. Pay attention to that pain and go, well, let me make some adjustments and see what happens with that. And over time, it emerges. Over time, you develop wisdom about who you are and what you are meant to be. And there's lots of ways of monitoring that. There's lots of self-reflection.
Can I add a little bit of that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just started thinking about, you guys brought up social media. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, over time, if we're in a society that's being conditioned to be a little bit more narcissistic, and like it's slowly changing the brain of most individuals, especially people who are on it a lot, does that become the new norm because we're so attuned to it consistently and it's shaping us and we feel like it's just a normal thing? Do you find that will become the new norm? We'll be more leaning towards that side, or there is some sort of fundamental essence to us which knows and can discern between what is conditioned and what is not?
It's a dialectic of progress, what Robert Keegan calls. Every time you have a new capacity, there's new pathology. Recent research with kids shows that an optimal amount of screen time that doesn't have to deal with school is about 2 hours a day. The average American kid is on it 8 hours a day, and those kids are less happy than previous generations. So we haven't created constraints in the culture around screen time that seem to optimize human happiness. It's very similar to food. There's way too much corn syrup in American food, which is causing an epidemic of childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes. we haven't created cultural constraints around healthy. And so what you see, just like you see at the beginning of almost everything, there's a lot of pathology that comes. If it continues to evolve, what you have is people beginning to develop the lower left quadrant, lower right quadrant, and upper left quadrant constraints that then, translate into the upper right quadrant, people being healthier, physically, psychologically. But right now, what we're seeing is new pathologies emerging. And one of them is, there is more narcissism objectively with subsequent generations. But the other thing is millennials tend to be more caring towards other people and more world-centric than other generations.
Which is another product of social media, because they're simply exposed to more perspectives. They have more opportunities for outrage.
Yeah. And so what we're seeing is a more complex, a multidimensional, international, world-centric culture that is just now developing norms for how to be a healthy person. And in the absence of those, we have less healthy people. So the answer to your question is, yes, there are problems. Yes, there are solutions. We're in an evolutionary process. And, for any one of us, for every one family, we want to be very much aware of those things.
Right.
My thing to my kids was always, in this country, this is the rule. Letting them know that, we're citizens, we're American citizens, but, we're not exactly, in this country is not exactly us.
Yeah. Well, and real briefly, Alex, Keith, before you asked your question, Keith, you had mentioned sort of just the natural wisdom of the body.
Yeah.
Which I think is another really powerful compass in terms of just being able to gauge how authentic am I being in any given moment. I just recently did a training program with Ryan Olke called Embodied Success, and it was fantastic. We're actually going to be putting it on the Integral Life platform in just a couple of weeks. And in fact, Alex, I'd like to give you a free enrollment to that course when we actually do, since you asked the question and gave me an opportunity to plug it. So when I release that course, get in touch with me. I'll give you a free enroll to it. It was really powerful for me because, being my path to Integral for years has been, a lot of it has been very sort of neck up. You know what I mean? I'm a very heady kind of guy. I mean, I've got a lot of heart too, but I've always had a difficult time due to just various childhood traumas and all that to really attune myself with my body. And this course helped tremendously, just in terms of being able to, take a moment and really genuinely check in with the wisdom of my body and allow whatever strength or weakness I feel within my body to inform whatever it is I'm looking to inform, whatever decision I'm trying to make, or just trying to get a sense of what feels more right, what feels more beautiful, what feels more true, etc. And it's powerful. So I think that one of the things that we're going to increasingly see is this bodily wisdom coming online, much in the same way that we've seen meditation hit the mainstream in a big way over the last 10 or 15 years. I think we're going to start seeing another phase that comes in to do with bodily wisdom. And I think this also gets to some of your second question, which is, right now, we've got things like Facebook, and it's clearly having a very, again, just corruptive influence on the ways that we self-organize and the ways that we relate to each other, and even the ways that we sort of relate with ourselves and sort of our personal sense of esteem and value and all of that. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is an increasing number of people who are getting uncomfortable with Facebook. The problem as it is right now is they have no place else to go that sort of gives them a more authentic experience. But I think what it's doing is it's creating this pressure. And as soon as someone innovates that next better platform, there's going to be a sort of a release. So I think that there are certain qualities that we're learning now because of social media for the first time, and they'll probably stick around for a little while. But I also get the sense that because the lower right quadrant is so transitory, that when something major shifts in the lower right quadrant, that same shift can be felt in the lower left and the upper left and our behaviors in the upper right. So I think things will change. The alchemy of sort of our cynicism and all of that. We'll probably always be cynical assholes, but we'll have different, sort of reasons to be cynical.
Awesome. Real cool. if you don't mind, can I throw one more question in there?
We have no other questions lined up, so do it.
Awesome. So you're talking about like body awareness and like just like feeling into the body to, you know, really find that that authentic guidance.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I don't know too much about the body, but I'm going to sort of spill what I think I know, and then maybe you can correct me on majority of the information that I'm about to share, and then sort of see where that goes. The biggest thing that my understanding is that our thoughts produce sort of like these neuropeptides, and they flow through the body and they bind to certain cells in different receptor sites. And then from that, the more we think about things, the more those specific neuropeptides we release, and then the cells start dividing with more of those receptor sites. So if we stress, we get, you know, more of the stress hormone, and our cells start dividing and loving more of that hormone and send a feedback loop to our brain to say, give me more stress hormones, like cortisol. So if we're listening to the body, but we've conditioned the body through the mind, what are we actually listening to? Does that make sense? Or
yes.
am I on a...
Yeah, totally.
So 1950, a psychologist named Donald Hebb said, neurons that fire together wire together, meaning that when you practice things, you develop neural networks that are dedicated to whatever it is you're practicing. Okay, so that's true. And you can develop bad habits, and bad habits, for instance, objectifying other people. That's a bad habit. Now, that's also not a very healthy habit. Okay? So what happens is with bad habits is that there's also a deeper sense of self that protests bad habits. And it protests with experiences of distress, with shame, with guilt, with difficult interpersonal experiences as you enact those bad habits. Now you can learn habits of dissociation and of cluelessness, and live a life where you're practicing more and more bad habits and eventually objectify other people. You can live your whole life that way. If you pay attention to your inner experience and you pay attention to your inner subjectivity with other people, the bad habits will be revealed. They'll be revealed in the feelings that you have and difficulties that you have with other people. And if you go deeper into them and ask for what good habits you want to replace those habits with, those habits will lead you in an evolutionary direction. They'll lead you up the evolutionary ladder. They're not going to lead you to more selfishness. They'll lead you to more care. They're not going to lead you to more self-neglect. They're going to lead you to more self-awareness and self-care. They're not going to lead you into more self-loathing. They're going to lead you into more self-acceptance. But if you have habits of avoiding interiors, as a lot of people in the 50s and 60s did, my parents' generation, you can get arrested at different developmental levels, and then pathologies will exist. But if that contemplative piece is there, you pay attention, it guides you. It guides you individually and intersubjectively, as you and I are guiding each other at this moment. And that's not random. There's a direction, an evolutionary directionality towards greater care, greater compassion, deeper consciousness. So there you go.
That's beautiful. Yeah, it feels like a question of sort of bodily intelligence versus bodily wisdom. Where like I've got an issue with sugar. It's probably because I live in Colorado, and Colorado has legalized marijuana, and there tends to be sort of a relationship between sugar and blah, blah. So I've got to watch myself with sugar. And what I notice is if I'm having a lot of sugar, if I'm having sugar every day, then my bodily intelligence says, "Hey, dude, give me sugar now. I want it. Right? I'm craving it." That's what my body intelligence is saying. And it's totally. And it's conditioned. It's conditioned by what I choose to put into my body and all the decisions I make and all that. However, there's another voice that's a bit quieter, but is also much larger, if that makes any sense. And it can be a little bit even, it can still be a little bit harder to find, which says, dude, you have felt like shit for the last 3 days because you ate too much sugar. You know that this is the reason why you feel like shit. You know this is why you snapped at your wife and why you didn't get good sleep last night and why you can't focus today and da da da. That to me is where the wisdom really comes online. It's a more subtle voice, and you have to put, I think, a little bit more effort towards tuning in to be able to hear it. But it's always there, and it's always saying something. And oftentimes your bodily wisdom is going to, be directly contradictory with your bodily intelligence.
And so,
Awesome.
yes, nice. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks.
Alex.
Now, does anyone else have a question or anything that a comment that they want to make?
Yeah, if there's any other questions, again, if you're on integrallife.com/live, there should be a link right underneath the video player to join us in Zoom. Once you're in Zoom, you can either raise your hand or you can press the Q&A button and type out a question. I'll read it to Keith. He will answer it. While we wait to see if there's any other questions, Keith, I got one more for you. Because again, so much of the context for this conversation seems to speak directly to the lower right quadrant, and namely, the way that we're struggling with wealth inequality, which is at like this historic level of imbalance. I mean, everyone, all the really, really smart, the experts are looking at the data and saying, this is not sustainable. This is not sustainable. And the crash is gonna hurt guys if we don't wise up soon. And I'm wondering whether is there any psychological or sociological data that we can use that suggests what a more ideal wealth distribution looks like? Because obviously in any capitalist society, I don't think I think it's a bit of a straw man to think that people want this completely level society where there's no rich and there's no poor, and it's a very naive thought. I mean, there's always going to be some wealth and inequality that's going to be inevitable with any society that has even an iota of capitalism encoded within it. So what's sort of a more sane distribution? Do you have any opinions on that?
Rob Smith, when we did a weekend about power, talked about how power shifts from value meme to value meme, and that the power of green, for instance, was the power to convene.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at cultural evolution, we can see that there's a directionality to it towards social democracy. The more holistically you think about a culture, the more it makes sense to allocate the resources of that culture to help people be whatever they want to be. Mm-hmm. Somebody wants to be super competitive and successful, they can go compete with each other. If people want to coast, they get to coast. If people want, and so on. And now you see this in cultures that are stable and that have organized their economies so that they're not exploiting anything. And also, they're in a peaceful environment where they're not taken over by other groups. Athens had a little bit of that, and they got conquered by the Romans, mm-hmm. who were more primitive. We live in an age now where it's harder to conquer other countries. So countries have a chance to mature on their own over a period of time. And I think that's what we're going to see. And eventually we're going to see this in the United States probably in the next 5 or 10 years. There's going to be a redistribution. Usually that happens in cultures historically through violence. Economies naturally create wealth inequity, and that will always happen. Mm-hmm. What you can have is you can have a larger structure that's adjusting for that. Okay, and the United States tried to do that and successfully in the last century, but then the economy did what it always does, and there hasn't been the adjustment, the correction yet. Potentially that correction could create all kinds of great stuff. I mean, it doesn't have to be a crash. Taking 10 or 15 trillion dollars from people who are most wealthy and investing it in infrastructure and helping people come along is not going to cause any kind of economic disruption. It's going to cause an incredible expansion of the middle class and an awful lot of wealth creation in any country that does that. But you have to have the political will to do it, and in democracies, Ken has been talking about the problem with democracies forever. Mm-hmm. That significant amount of people are manipulatable enough, then they can be manipulated away from making these decisions. So, but I think that in the long run, evolution wins out. There's a lot of pain and suffering, but what we'll see less violent redistribution, but we'll also see economies continuing create that discrepancy because that's what human economies have historically always done.
Yep.
And that's fine. You know, if it's regulated, it can just be a cyclic thing. It doesn't have to involve violence. Canada hasn't ever had any banking crises in the last 100 years.
Right.
We've had 17 of them. You know, their banks have made plenty of money, but they just happen to have a global regulatory climate where banks can go up and down, but not crash their economies because, you know, there's a constraint. That's what social democracy provides. It doesn't let people get so much power that they can screw everybody else over, like what happened in 2008. So I think that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
And, you know, and people are always going to be the same. They're going to have to grow through the same stages. And until you get to a place where you're world-centric and have compassion for everybody, you're going to be in it for me first or my kid first. Or, you know, if I write you a check, you can get my kid into Harvard. You know, it's going to be like that. That doesn't stop because that's a stage.
Right. Right.
So, you know, have a sense of humor, have a little compassion.
Right. Well, it's such a tough question to answer too, because, you know, we know that there are these like massively explosive technological trends that are just right behind the corner.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
this is often my reaction to people who freak out about Trump and how disruptive he is. And it's like, well, look, he's just getting in front of the story a little bit because we're about to enter the era of disruption from, you know, sort of technologies like automation and genetics and, you know, robotics and all of this stuff to climate change. I mean, any one of these can be enough to dramatically redistribute wealth with or without sort of our, you know, our support. But, you know, when we actually see sort of so many of them coming in at the same time, I think this is going to create new opportunities. I mean, Ken just did a dialogue with Warren Farrell talking about feminism and you know, the state of the men's movement and all that. And the hypothesis that, you know, I tried to bring to that piece was, you know, over the last 100 years, there's been all this pressure for women to move from what was classically the private sphere into the public sphere. And this is largely due to new sets of values that emerged with Orange and, you know, new industrial technologies that allowed women, you know, gave women more opportunity in the public sphere in a way that they didn't have 500, 1,000 years ago. However, what we haven't seen is an equivalent movement of men from the public sphere into the private. And we see some of the pain points around this. We see men who, you know, talk about, who gets the kid most often in divorce cases and things like that. Men are beginning to tune into these issues, but it's not taken very seriously by culture yet. I think my own hypothesis is in the automation age, that is what's actually going to force a lot of men out of the public and back into the private sphere and actually force them to reconsider their identity in relation to the private sphere. As Warren Farrell says, men usually had to demonstrate their love for the family by being away from the family and making money. Well, new opportunities are going to, I mean, I often use myself as an example where, not that I'm like the fucking paragon of masculine development or anything like that, but I'm able to do this work from home, which means I'm able to raise my daughter from home. I feel enormous gratitude that I have, you know, more opportunity to spend time with my daughter and raise her than, you know, most likely 99.5% of men in history have had, because there was this pressure to be outside of the home and have a career and all that. And that has largely come to define the man's role. I personally think that when we hit this next era of disruption, it's going to cause this massive recalibration for men and women alike. And we're going to have an opportunity to construct new ways of creating identities for ourselves that can benefit from both public sphere involvement and success and achievement and all that, as well as private sphere connection and love and family and hearth and home and all that stuff too. So it, you know.
Well, in a way, what you're describing is people bringing all four quadrants into understanding their own life. There's a lot of data about the importance of fathers.
Yep.
Americans work more hours than any other country. That means less hours for family.
Yep.
You know, there was a question about what will be the impact of this college admissions scandal on the collective consciousness around not just evolution, but colleges. And I wanted to speak to that before we stopped.
Yeah, and we have another person with their hand raised, so actually we can keep going if you want.
So the comment was made by JK.
Yep, and we have another question from Carolyn.
Yeah, and people in colleges have been self-examining a lot the last 20 years. They're very interested in being value added and in interfacing what they're offering kids and young people to make them better people and to make them more successful and better contributors into the future. And we're reaching a breaking point because of the costs involved. So I think one thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of public money going into education. Okay, and I think that education is going to spread into including other skills that haven't been included in colleges before. I think colleges will be redefined somewhat that way. And I think that's what's going to be happening in the next 10 or 15 years. Mm. So somebody raised their hand.
Yeah. And Keith, just to add on to that, I think that sort of decentralized learning is going to become increasingly important. I mean, there's entire curricula you can learn on YouTube right now, for example. So I think the opportunities for self-education are going to continue. That's the funny thing about the internet is it's like, if you have the motivation to learn, you can learn anything you want to. The only problem is the internet doesn't come with motivation.
But we do.
Right?
People do.
People do. Seriously. All right, so let's bring Carolyn on over. All right, Carolyn, looks like your video and audio are off. Oh, and you're turning them back on. Now we just need to turn your audio on. Oh, I see you talking, but I can't hear you. Still can't hear you, Carolyn. There should be a button somewhere, maybe in the lower left of the player. Oh, no. Well, Carolyn, I can keep you on the line for a minute longer so you can see if you can get the audio going. Usually there's a little button in the lower left corner that says turn audio on or something like that. If you can't find it, you can always type in your question and I'll read it. Oh, she can't hear us either.
Too bad.
Oh, I'm sorry, Carolyn.
Well, maybe next time, Carolyn.
She's typing right now. Let me get back to her.
Okay.
We cannot hear you. Is there a button? Bear with us, people. We're making sausage.
I'm sorry.
There we go. Carolyn, so nice to hear you.
I do this all the time. I can't believe I missed the mute button. Well, I don't have a question so much as a comment that I wanted to make. And you're talking about how you can learn anything on the internet, and that's possibly true. But I want to just say how much I appreciate this dialogue today. And Dr. Keith, really, I can tell you've put a lot into this presentation. And for me, just being kind of, I can't say I'm new to Integral anything. I've been around like a while. But just hearing how you talk about it and dialogue back and forth and just talk about the theory in terms of just everyday events just helps it step into place for me. And I just find it just valuable learning. I just wanted to appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome.
Laura, it's like, Corey, you were saying that you could find this information on the internet. And trust me, I've been trying to noodle around the internet for a while. But when you come to Integral Life, and these presentations in particular for me, no, the learning is deeper, it's exponential, and it's rare. That's what I find. It's just unique and rare. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciate that.
That's such fantastic feedback. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, that's right to the heart. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm glad we were able to give Carolyn a voice.
Do I just turn my?
Oh, there. See, right in the middle of a sentence, I kicked her out. No, that was really sweet, and I totally agree, Keith. You have such just a beautiful communication style. And you show up to these calls with just a great big brain and a full heart and just this energy. And I love it. I love doing these with you. This is a precious part of my own work that I do.
Back at you, Corey.
Yeah. So it doesn't look like there's any other questions. So should we talk about this survey and what we plan on doing with it?
Yeah. We have a survey we're sending to everybody. Please fill it out and send it back because we're curious about what brought everybody to Integral. And I know there's more than one thing, so you can answer yes to all the questions, or somewhat yes or somewhat no, and that kind of stuff. Because we're just curious about it for a variety of reasons. And most of them are forced choice questions, the Likert scale. But there's one where you can actually write some stuff down, and we encourage you to do that. Because Corey and I want to know what you're thinking and what brought you to Integral and how you understand it and that kind of stuff. And we'll have other surveys hopefully in the future. But please do this one. Send it to us, and then we'll talk about it in a subsequent podcast. And given that we're all part of the integral awakening that's happening around this planet, a lot of people have never heard of Integral or part of the integral awakening. The more that we can kind of understand the nuances of it, the more we can contribute to it. So please fill out it's very short.
Yep.
And we're very curious. So we're curious about you. And so please help us understand.
And again, that survey can be found right underneath this video, wherever it's posted on integrallife.com. So do it. Fill it out.
Yes.
Inform us. Well, Keith, this has been awesome as always, man.
It's been awesome as always. Good seeing you, Corey. Good seeing everybody. Much love to everybody, and see you all next time, hopefully.
That's right. We'll see you guys next month. In the meantime, adios.
Bye-bye.